In the autumn of 1991, every grain farmer in Lac-Saint-Jean County, Quebec, seeded their winter wheat the same way. This was not a choice, it was weather, it was the calendar. It was the way October worked in that part of the country, where the frost came early and the ground didn't forgive you for being slow. You drilled your seed into plowed ground, you applied your nitrogen, and you hoped the snow came before the cold did. Not because anyone had sat down and decided this was the best possible system, but because it was the system, and the system had always worked well enough, and in farming, well enough is sometimes all you need. The Fortin farm sat on 320 acres east of Alma, on ground that had been in the family since 1938. Emile Fortin had bought the original parcel from a neighbor who was leaving for work in the paper mills at Jonquière, and his son Marcel had added to it through the 50s and 60s until it was a real farm, a serious farm, the kind of farm that people in Lac-Saint-Jean knew by name. Marcel's son, Gaspard Fortin, had taken it over in 1979 and had run it the way his father had. Winter wheat in the fall, barley in rotation, synthetic nitrogen every season, repeat. Gaspard was 52 years old in 1991, and he was not a man who doubted his methods. He had reasons not to. His yields were consistent. His equipment was paid off. He sat on the board of the local agricultural cooperative and had done since 1984, and the other men on that board respected his opinion on inputs and soil management and the kind of practical decisions that kept a grain operation running through bad springs and wet harvests. He was not arrogant. He was certain. There is a difference, though sometimes it is hard to see from the outside. His daughter-in-law, Nathalie Fortin, was 47 years old and had been married to Gaspard's son Philippe for 19 years. She had grown up on a mixed operation north of Chicoutimi, her father raising both beef cattle and field crops on ground that was not as rich as Lac-Saint-Jean, but that had been managed differently, more carefully, with an eye toward what the soil needed rather than what the season demanded. She had come to the Fortin farm as a young woman and had learned to do things Gaspard's way, because Gaspard's way was the way things were done here, and she was not a woman who made trouble. But Nathalie had been reading. Let me tell you about what Nathalie had been reading, because it matters more than anything else in this story. In the late 80s and early 1990s, there was a body of research coming out of agriculture, Canada, and several provincial agronomy programs that most grain farmers in Quebec had not heard of and would not have sought out if they had. It was not the kind of thing that got discussed at cooperative board meetings or in the seed catalogs that arrived every January. It had to do with soil compaction, with what continuous tillage was doing year over year to the physical structure of the ground itself. A researcher at Laval University named Dr. François Racine had published a series of papers on subsoil compaction in conventionally tilled grain operations in the St. Lawrence lowlands, and his findings were not comfortable reading for anyone who had been running a moldboard plow through their fields every autumn for 30 years. What Dr. Racine had documented in dense technical language that Nathalie had spent 3 winters translating into practical terms she could actually use was this: conventional fall tillage in grain operations was creating a hardpan layer, a zone of compaction, at the bottom of the tillage depth, typically 8 to 10 inches below the surface, that was invisible from above and nearly impossible to detect without a penetrometer or a soil pit. The hardpan was not dramatic. It did not announce itself. You could look at a field that had been plowed for 40 years and see black earth and good structure in the top 8 inches and have no idea that below that there was a layer of soil compressed to a density that plant roots could not penetrate, that water could not move through, and that was getting more compacted with every pass of the plow. The implications were significant. In a dry summer, crops on compacted ground ran out of subsoil moisture faster because their roots could not go deep enough to find it. In a wet spring, the hardpan held water above it and created waterlogging conditions that the surface appeared to drain while the subsoil stayed saturated. The synthetic nitrogen applied on top of compacted ground was being used inefficiently because the root systems accessing it were shallow and constrained. Not because the nitrogen itself was wrong, but because the architecture of the soil had been quietly broken underneath it. Dr. Racine's proposed solution was not popular with the equipment dealers. It was no-till seeding, direct seeding into undisturbed ground year after year, allowing the soil's own biological activity and the natural action of freeze-thaw cycles to rebuild the structure that tillage had destroyed. It required a different planter, it required a different relationship with weeds, it required patience, because the recovery of a compacted soil was not a single-season event. It was a 5 to 7 year process that looked worse before it looked better, and that offered nothing dramatic enough to point to in year 1 or year 2. Natalie had underlined that passage. She had written in the margin, "This is why the South Field drains the way it does." She brought it up in March of 1992. She waited until after supper on a Sunday, when Philippe was relaxed and Gaspard was in the kind of mood that comes from a good meal and no immediate problems. She put Dr. Racine's papers on the kitchen table, next to the seed catalog, and she said she wanted to try something on the South Field. Gaspard looked at the papers. He looked at Natalie. He said, "What kind of something?" She explained it the way Dr. Racine had explained it, as carefully and plainly as she could. The hardpan layer, the root depth restriction, the water infiltration problem. She told him that the South Field had been yielding 15 to 20% below the farm average for the past decade despite identical inputs, and that she believed the reason was compaction. She told him that direct seeding into standing stubble without fall tillage, combined with a one-time deep ripping to break the existing hardpan, could begin to restore the soil's vertical structure in a way that no amount of surface fertilizer was going to fix. She told him the equipment cost and the yield trajectory she was expecting over 5 years based on the Laval trial data. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Philippe looked at the papers and then at his father. Gaspard set down his coffee. "You want to leave ground unplowed going into winter," he said. "On the South Field, yes. In Lac Saint-Jean, yes." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I'll think about it." He thought about it for a week. On the 8th day, he told Natalie she could try the South Field. Not the whole farm, the South Field, which was 80 acres of the least productive ground they had, low-lying, slow to warm in spring, the field that had caused more headaches per acre than any other parcel on the operation. "If it makes a mess of next year's stand," he said, "we don't do it again." Natalie said that was fair. "Let me tell you about what happened at the Lac Saint-Jean grain growers meeting in April of 1992. Because it is the moment this story turns, and you need to understand the room before you can understand what was said in it. The spring meeting of the grain growers was held in the community hall in Alma on the second Wednesday of April, and it was the kind of gathering where the men who had been farming the county for 30 years sat in the back rows, and the equipment dealers and agronomists stood at the front, and the conversations that happened between the formal sessions were more important than anything said at the microphone. The man who held the most authority in those between-session conversations was a fellow named Réjean Villeneuve. Réjean had been the regional agronomist for the Provincial Extension Service since 1978, and he had a manner that combined genuine expertise with an absolute confidence in his own conclusions that made him difficult to argue with, even when he was wrong. He was not a bad man. He had helped a lot of farmers through difficult seasons, and his advice on fungicide timing and variety selection was generally sound. But his opinion of no-till in Quebec's climate was fixed and had been fixed for 15 years, and no amount of research from Laval or Agriculture Canada was going to move it in a single conversation. Natalie had come to the meeting with Philippe to pick up the spring input price sheets. She was not there to present anything, but she stopped to say hello to a neighbor near the display tables, and Régent Villeneuve was standing close enough to hear when the neighbor asked what the Fortins were planning this season. Natalie said they were trying direct seeding on the south field, starting this spring. Régent Villeneuve put down his coffee. He said, "Natalie, you're not serious." She said she was. He said, "You can't no-till winter wheat in this climate. The residue management alone in a short season like ours creates disease pressure that you can't manage without tillage. That's been established." He looked around at the people nearby in the way that a man does when he expects the room to confirm what he's saying. Your seedbed temperatures are going to be 5 degrees colder going into fall than your neighbors. Your emergence is going to be uneven, and you're going to be managing a weed population that your herbicide program isn't set up for. He was not unkind about it. He was patient, the way a teacher is patient with a student who has misunderstood a concept that the teacher has explained many times. Natalie said, "Doctor, Racine's compaction data from the trials at Sainte-Anne-de-la-Pocatière shows that the disease pressure argument doesn't hold past year 3 of a well-managed no-till system." Régent said that the Sainte-Anne trials were on different soil types and that Lac Saint Jean's clay fraction made the situation not comparable. Someone near the back said, "I'll tell you one thing. I can't afford an experiment on my ground right now." A few people nodded. Régent looked at Natalie with the expression of a man who has said what he came to say. He told her to talk to him after the harvest in November and let him know how the south field looked. He said it the way you say something when you already know the answer. Natalie picked up her price sheets and walked out with Philippe, and they drove home, and she went out to the south field that evening and stood at the edge of it in the April cold and looked at the stubble standing up from the previous year's barley. The ground was still half frozen. It looked like every other field in the county. She walked in about 20 feet from the fence and pushed a soil probe into the ground and pulled the core. The top 8 inches were good, dark, structured. Below that, at exactly 9 inches, the probe resistance jumped sharply, and the core came out, compressed and dense, the color of old clay. She had pulled this core 3 times in 3 different spots and gotten the same result every time. She put the core in her coat pocket and drove back to the house and called the equipment dealer in Alma about the Deep Ripper rental for May. Let me tell you about the planting, because the details matter. Natalie deep-ripped the south field in early May before the ground fully softened, running the ripper shanks to 14 inches on 8-inch spacing, cutting through the hardpan in a single pass without inverting or mixing the soil above it. She left the field to settle for 2 weeks and then direct seeded the winter wheat in late August using a borrowed no-till drill from an operation near Saint-Félicien that had been experimenting with the system for 4 years. The drill required adjustment. The seed-to-soil contact in standing residue was not as clean as in a prepared seedbed, and she spent a full day calibrating the coulter pressure and the closing wheel tension before she was satisfied with the results. The wheat emerged in 12 days. The stand was slightly uneven in 2 areas near the low corner of the field where residue had bunched, but across the 80 acres the plant population was within acceptable range. She took emergence counts every 5 days and recorded them in a notebook she had bought specifically for this field. The rest of the farm was seeded the conventional way. Fall plowing, worked seedbed, same wheat variety, same inputs. Régent Villeneuve drove past the south field in September and later told someone at the co-op that the stand looked thinner than it should. He was not wrong. It was thinner in those two corners. What he did not see, because he did not stop and walk the field, was that across the remaining 73 acres, the stand density was actually above the farm's historical average for that variety, emerging into soil that had not been disturbed at its surface and was retaining moisture in the upper horizon rather than losing it to the evaporation that came with tillage. The wheat went into winter, and Natalie covered it in her notebook and waited. Let me tell you about the spring of 1993, because that is when the numbers began to matter. The south field emerged from snowmelt 2 weeks later than the conventionally tilled ground, which was exactly what Régent had predicted. But by mid-May, the tiller gap had closed, because the undisturbed soil structure was warming more evenly and retaining the heat it received rather than cycling it out through the void spaces that tillage creates. By the first week of June, the south field was within 5 days of the rest of the farm in development stage. Natalie was also tracking something Régent had not mentioned: earthworms. She had been doing earthworm counts since the previous fall, pushing a spade into the ground in 12 locations across the south field and in 12 comparison spots on the adjacent conventionally tilled ground, counting every earthworm in a 30-centimeter cube of soil. In the fall of 1992, the south field had averaged 4.2 earthworms per sample, and the tilled ground had averaged 3.8. By the spring of 1993, one season in, the no-till ground had 7.1 per sample. The tilled ground was 3.6. Earthworms, Dr. Racine had written, are the best practical indicator of soil biological activity and macropore development available to a farmer without laboratory equipment. Their channels are the pathways that water follows through a soil profile. Where earthworm counts are high, infiltration rates are high. Where they are low, the soil is telling you something. The 1993 harvest came in at 4.1 tons per hectare on the south field. The rest of the farm averaged 3.8. The south field had done 3.2 the previous year and 3.3 the year before that. Natalie recorded it in her notebook and did not say anything about it at the supper table. She waited for Gaspard to notice the numbers in the bin receipts, which he did in October, going through the fall paperwork at the kitchen table with his reading glasses on. He looked up from the receipts. The south field did better this year. Yes, she said. He was quiet for a moment. He went back to the receipt. Says, did you reduce the nitrogen application on that field? Same rate as the rest, she said. He went quiet again for longer. He looked at the receipts and then out the window at the field road, where you could just see the top of the south fence line in the fading November light. Then he said, you want to expand it. I want to do the whole farm eventually, she said, but I think we should take it in sections. 3 years to transition each parcel so we're not disrupting the whole operation at once. He thought about it while he put the receipts back in their folder. Then he said, you decide the sections. You tell me what you need. Let me tell you about the summer of 1995, because what happened that summer made Natalie's argument in a way that no notebook or soil pit ever could. The summer of 1995 brought one of the driest July and August periods that Lac Saint Jean had seen since the early 1970s. The pattern set in by the third week of June. Rain came in short events that were not enough to recharge subsoil moisture and then stopped. The jet stream sat too far north, and the warm, dry air that moved in from the interior baked the crops through a month and a half of weather that farmers in the county described afterward as the worst they could remember. Grain crops on conventionally managed ground began showing moisture stress by mid-July. The leaves rolled, the flag leaf on wheat lost its color, Yield estimates at the local elevator dropped week by week through August, and the agronomists who drove the territory came back to their offices looking grim. The Fortin South field and the adjacent parcels that had now been in no-till for 2 and 3 years respectively were not doing well. 1995 was not a good year for anyone in Lac Saint Jean. But the no-till ground was doing differently. The earthworm channels that had been building since 1992 were drawing rainfall down into the subsoil, rather than letting it sheet off the surface. The organic matter that had been accumulating under undisturbed residue from 2.8% in 1992 to 3.6% by 1995 on the oldest no-till parcels was holding available water in the rooting zone through periods when the tilled ground had already exhausted its accessible moisture. The root systems on the no-till ground had been growing deeper each year into a subsoil profile that was no longer compressed at 9 inches, and in the dry July they were reaching moisture that the shallow-rooted crops on compacted ground could not access. The South Field, 3 years into the system, came in at 3.3 tons per hectare in the fall of 1995. The rest of the Fortin farm, which still had parcels in the early transition years, averaged 2.9. The county average for winter wheat that season was 2.4 tons per hectare. The elevator in Alma was quiet in the way that only happens when the harvest is short and everyone knows it. Natalie ran the numbers in her notebook. At the 1995 wheat price of $168 per ton, the South Field had returned $554 per hectare. The county average ground had returned $403 per hectare. The difference was $151 per hectare. Across her 80 acres of established no-till ground, that was over $12,000 in a year when a lot of operations in the county were having conversations with their bank managers that nobody wanted to have. She brought the notebook to the kitchen table on a Sunday evening in October and laid it open beside Gaspard's coffee cup. She did not say anything. She just sat down and let him read the numbers. He read them for a long time. Have you ever watched someone read a page of numbers and have to revise something they have believed for 20 years? It does not happen quickly. It happens in stages. First, there is the reading, and then there is the rereading, and then there is a long period of looking at something that is not the page. Gaspard sat at that table with his coffee going cold and looked out the window for almost 5 minutes before he said anything. He said, "I should have let you try this on more ground sooner," Natalie said. "The South Field is why we have the data." He looked at her. "I know," he said. "That's not what I mean." Philippe, who was sitting at the counter pretending to read a parts catalog, did not look up. But he was not reading. Let me tell you about the morning Régin Villeneuve drove down the Fortin Farm Road in November of 1995, because it is the moment this story has been moving toward since that April meeting in the community hall 3 years before. He came in his provincial extension truck, and he parked in the lane and found Natalie in the equipment shed doing a pre-winter check on the no-till drill. He stood in the doorway with his hands in his coat pockets, and he had the look of a man who has thought carefully about what he is going to say. "Natalie," he said, "you have a minute?" She looked up from the drill. "Of course, Régin." He came in and stood looking at the drill for a moment and then at the floor. "I've been putting together the district yield summary," he said, "and your no-till parcels are showing up as outliers in a way I can't account for by soil type or variety selection." He paused. "The 1995 numbers from your South Field, specifically. What have you seen?" He told her the numbers. She did not correct him because he had them right. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have 3 producers in my district who are asking me what they should be doing differently after this summer. And I've been telling them that no-till in our climate is a special case and that the disease and temperature management problems are significant." He stopped. He said, I think I may have been working off data that was 15 years old. Natalie set down her wrench. She looked at Rajan for a moment, and then she said something she had not planned to say, but that came out of 3 years of driving to and from that meeting in Alma, and remembering how it felt to stand in the community hall and have your evidence dismissed by someone who had not read it. Rajan, she said, do you remember the spring meeting in 1992? He knew what she was referring to. He did not pretend otherwise. You told me the residue management problems were established and not comparable to Santan. You said the clay fraction in our soils made the trial data irrelevant. And you said to call you in November after harvest, and you said it the way you say something you don't actually expect to hear back about. He looked at the floor. I know, he said. I'm not telling you that to settle a score, she said. I'm telling you because your 3 producers who are asking what to do differently, they could have been asking in 1992 if the information had reached them. The dry summer of 1995 did not have to damage as many operations in this county as it did. She picked up her wrench again. Come by in the spring and I'll walk your producers through the system. I'll show them the soil cores from before and after, and the earthworm counts and the infiltration data. They can see what 7 years of tillage compaction looks like and what 3 years of no-till does to start reversing it. He nodded. He said he appreciated it. He stood there another moment and then put his hat back on and walked out to his truck. Natalie watched the truck pull out of the lane and then went back to the drill. Let me tell you about what followed, because the story does not end in that equipment shed. By 1997, 11 farms in Lac St. John County had begun transitioning some portion of their acreage to no-till or minimum tillage systems. Rajan Villeneuve, to his credit, presented the Fortin farm data at the Provincial Agronomy Conference in Quebec City in 1998 and described the compaction recovery results in detail, citing Dr. Racine's original papers and the field-level confirmation from the Fortin operation. He acknowledged in that presentation that his 1992 assessment of no-till viability in the region had been based on outdated climate assumptions, and that the transition management challenges, while real, were addressable. He said it clearly in a room of 200 agronomists. Natalie was not in the room. She was home. But Philippe was, and he called her from a payphone in the lobby to tell her what Rajan had said and how the room had responded, and she stood in the kitchen holding the phone and did not say anything for a moment and then said, "Good." Just that. Good. Natalie completed the full farm transition to no-till by 2001. The process took 9 years from the first 80 acres to the last parcel, moving in sections the way she had described to Gaspard at the kitchen table in 1993. It was not smooth. There were 2 wet springs in the late 90s where the residue management on newly converted parcels created emergence problems that cost them yield, and 1 year where a volunteer crop of barley came through the wheat stand on a field that had not been given the full transition protocol. These were real problems, and she recorded all of them in the notebook alongside the successes, because the notebook was not a promotional document. It was a record. By 2001, the farm average yield on winter wheat was 4.4 tons per hectare. In 1991, before Natalie had brought Dr. Racine's papers to the kitchen table, it had been 3.6. The nitrogen application rate across the operation had been reduced by 22% on average as organic matter levels climbed and the soil's own nitrogen cycling capacity recovered. The input cost reduction was significant enough that Gaspard mentioned it specifically when he tallied the year-end numbers, which was not something he had ever done in the years when the cost was simply what it was and there was no comparison to make. The South Field, the original 80 acres, was running 4.7 tons per hectare by 2002. The hard pan that Natalie had measured with a soil probe in April of 1992 was gone. The penetrometer readings from 2 meters below the surface showed uniform resistance across the entire tillage profile and below it, which meant that roots were going as deep as the plant needed them to go and not stopping at 9 inches the way they had for decades. She showed those penetrometer readings to Gaspard in the spring of 2003. He looked at them for a long time, the way he had looked at the receipts in 1993, with the reading glasses on and the kitchen quiet. Then he said, "When I gave you the South Field in 1992, I thought I was giving you something to fail on where it wouldn't matter." She said, "The South Field is the reason we have 11 years of data." "I know," he said, "that's what I'm saying." He put the penetrometer readings on top of the green ledger book where he kept the farm accounts, which was where he put things he wanted to remember. Let me tell you about one more thing, because it is the part of this story that matters most. In the spring of 2008, Natalie's son, Matthew, was 26 years old and had been working the farm since finishing his agricultural technician diploma in Alma. He had grown up with no-till the way his grandfather had grown up with the moldboard plow. It was simply what the Fortin farm did, the way the frost came early and the ground didn't forgive you for being slow. Not a decision, but a fact. Mathieu came to his mother one morning in April with a printout he had pulled from an Agriculture Canada research bulletin about a mixed grain and forage operation in Manitoba that was integrating cover crops into a no-till rotation in a way that was building organic matter at a rate that made the Fortin Farm's recovery trajectory look like the beginning of something, rather than the end of it. The bulletin described soil organic matter levels above 5% on continuously managed no-till ground with multi-species cover crop mixes, with corresponding reductions in synthetic inputs that the authors described as approaching biological sufficiency. Mathieu put the printout on the kitchen table and said, "I want to try something on the South Field." Natalie looked at the printout. She did not pause. She did not offer him the worst parcel on the farm as a consolation prize. She did not say she needed to think about it. She said, "How many acres do you need?" That is what the notebook was for. Not only to record what worked, but to remember what it cost to be the person who believed it would work before anyone else did. The Fortin farm is still there east of Alma, 320 acres of black Lac St. Jean ground that has been in the same family for more than 80 years. The organic matter in those fields runs above 4% on most parcels and above 4.5% on the South Field, numbers that the NRCS counterpart in Quebec, the local Cross Soil Health Advisors, have begun using as reference points when they work with other grain operations in the county. The synthetic nitrogen applications that Gaspard Fortin was running at 120 kilograms per hectare in 1991 have been reduced to an average of 72 across the operation. The earthworm counts that Natalie started recording with a spade and a notebook in 1992 are now part of a formal monitoring protocol that Mathieu runs every spring. Réjean Villeneuve retired from the Extension Service in 2004. He stopped at the Fortin farm the autumn before he left and stood at the fence line of the South Field in the October light and looked at the standing wheat stubble and the dark, undisturbed soil between the rows and was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I should have come to look at this in 1993. Natalie said that the 11 producers he had sent her way in 1997 and 1998 had been in time for the dry years of the early 2000s, and that was what mattered. He said he found some comfort in that. She thought he meant it. The notebook with the earthworm counts and the penetrometer readings and the yield comparisons and the 2 pages where she had recorded the bad years honestly, without softening them, is in the kitchen drawer. Gaspard's ledger book is there beside it. Both of them are full. She left the ground unplowed going into winter. They said the climate wouldn't allow it. The drought came. The tilled fields ran dry. The no-till ground held.